Thank you.
Well done. Well done. It's a pleasure to welcome you, and please do introduce your session and your panelists. Welcome.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, and welcome also to everyone that is that is also listening to us virtually. So today sessions, I guess we're going to start with a poll, just to introduce the topic. And I guess I would like to understand from the audience if you actually think that the pandemic has actually changed the behavior of criminals.
100%.
Yes? Okay. And now 2 years down the line, do you actually think that companies are prepared to fight the new ways of fraud? No? No? Yes? Okay, and what about in terms of cybersecurity? Do you think companies are well prepared? They do have a robust cyber hygiene? No? Okay, you're very quiet, but I hoped with this topic today, after the session, you will feel more comfortable talking about that. So I guess that will help us to introduce the first question. And I guess it's also very important to highlight that with the digital economy, this topic has actually become very important. And as you are going to hear here today, there's been an alarming spike in claims, not just in the insurance industry, but as well in terms of malicious scams. And also there's been a lot of fraudulent notifications. And I guess this is highlighting the fact that with digitalization, companies are still not prepared, and there are very sophisticated scams and tactics. Fraud has actually become the best source of income, and there is a need for companies to start looking into that, tackle that, and also increase their cybersecurity. So the first question, I guess, is how has remote working changed the threat scenario? Are there any new vulnerabilities out there? Are companies prepared? Who would like to take this question? Maybe Tom?
Yeah, well, I think obviously with the move to remote working, I think that means that there has been generally a shift of the risk towards remote access protocols, towards cloud infrastructure. And I think it's an interesting that you raised the question to the audience, are people prepared? And I think one of the things that I took away from just talking to other people in the industry is that a lot of companies, some companies were already doing remote working. Some industries were a lot better at remote working before. I would say that London Market Insurance is not one of them. So I think quite a lot of companies had to fast track their plans to move to remote working. They had to bring in systems, bring in new softwares, develop new processes that maybe they didn't have before. And unfortunately, as we all know, generally when you hurry something, things get missed. You might miss a certain vulnerability. You might not do as much research into whether that software fits your current system and your security. So I would say that it's definitely created new avenues for fraudsters to attack with that, and all of the additional endpoints that people using their own devices at home, maybe not updating their software and when they're supposed to. So yeah, I would say it's definitely, whether it's increased it is hard to say, but I think it's definitely created new avenues and made it a little bit easier in some cases for fraudsters.
And in terms of the notifications, perhaps have you actually seen an increase in fraud notifications?
Well, touching on Tom's point, we've all had to adapt in the pandemic and during the periods of lockdown that we've been through. Anybody who says they haven't had to make those adaptations probably isn't telling you the truth. We've at Allianz Global, we're a global company providing international insurance solutions for multinational companies, and in that respect, we've always worked across multiple jurisdictions, multiple territories. Our project teams are global teams, so there has always been an element of working in virtual teams remotely and harnessing the technology to still be efficient and effective in our jobs across the different territories that we operate in. So to a certain extent, we were ready for the move to working from home, but there have been adaptations that we've had to make. And just as we've adapted, we've seen fraudsters and bad actors in society also make those adaptations, because a lot of the traditional avenues for committing fraud that were previously available to them have been closed off also by the move to remote working and society really coming to a stop. So there have been challenges from a fraud perspective, in that fraud has moved and evolved and looks different today to how it looked pre-pandemic, and there are several reasons behind that shift in fraudulent behaviour. But in terms of where we are as a fraud fighting community, the move to working remotely, really, the point I would stress here is that you cannot underestimate the value in being present. So pre-pandemic, some of my best fraud detection happened in the lift, because I was there and people saw me and they were going about their business and they'd mention to you in the lift, oh, I've got this thing that I need to refer to you. There's this thing that I've seen that's suspicious. And seeing you here is the reminder that we have a fraud process and that we need to adhere to that and comply with it. And I would say silo mentality is the enemy of effective fraud detection strategies. And it's difficult enough working in insurance where we all have specialist silos. When we went to home working, those silos increased in number and reduced dramatically in size. So we've had to be more proactive in our approach to finding fraud. We've had to reach out more, we've needed to carry out more audits. And when it comes to fraud detection, we've had to go and look for it and not be reliant on what people bring to us. So there have been dramatic shifts as a result of the pandemic, and certainly the behaviour of fraudsters has adapted just as the behaviour of everybody in this room has changed.
Okay, that's very interesting, because I actually thought the opposite. I thought that the remote working increased the ability of carriers to be able to manage the incidents, and also, I guess, from the cost saving perspective, it was also much better. I don't know if there is anything that would you like to add in terms of that. Do you believe that it has been cost saving for carriers? The fact that now everything is done remotely, perhaps now with cyber incidents. I don't know what are your thoughts about that.
I think, so for cyber incidents, it's definitely, if there's one positive that's come out of this whole situation, is that there's more of an acceptance that things can be done remotely. So for your incident response service providers, they previously, insureds would be very much like, I want boots on the ground, I want those technicians in my building, working on my computers, using my keyboards. But there's a lot more acceptance of remote working, so it's a lot quicker for incident response teams to get involved, ramp up, and deal with urgent situations. So I think that has been one. It's easy to kind of sit here and scaremonger and kind of it's all doom, but I think there are definitely some positives that have resulted probably in some cost savings and efficiency.
Okay.
I would just add to that in terms of kind of insurers adopting kind of new technologies and working with third parties. So I work at Anthemis, we're an early stage venture capital fund that focuses on insurance and risk management, and what we're seeing in the industry is actually an acceleration in insurers being willing to work with new technology providers to solve some of these issues that traditionally they would try and handle in-house. So if you take cyber startup venture funding, for example, in Q1 of this year, it amounted to 5 billion globally, which is a 50% increase on last year. And that means that this year is on track to beat the 20 billion that was invested into cyber security startups last year. And so while, it is definitely still a problem, and I think we are very much at the start of using technology to tackle this problem, we have seen this acceleration in both adoption and also kind of insurers willing to work with third parties to tackle some of these problems.
That's actually a very good point, can actually help us move nicely to the next question, which will be how can insurers integrate anti-fraud systems into the underwriting tools and processes that we currently have available?
I think for me, turning to the underwriting, I think what we're seeing in the cyber world, and it's something that a lot of insurers are beginning to offer, is pre-incident services and consultancy. So I would say up until fairly recently, and this is certainly something that we'd seen at Tokio and Kiln as a London market insurer, we'd kind of seen that we have the offering out there, but insureds weren't particularly looking to engage with that. They were like, I think uptake was relatively low, but what we're seeing now is increased uptake on that, and that is one way in which businesses can absolutely improve their protections against fraud, because you have the opportunity to interact with expert consultants that can help you not only look at your systems, so have you got end-of-life software that's still in place that presents a vulnerability, and is there a way that can be moved? Have you got certain processes, so is the way that your business operates, is there some vulnerabilities in there, not necessarily in these systems themselves, but just how you interact, how the humans in your business interact with your technology. So I think that's one way in which cyber insurers can integrate a little bit more anti-fraud, more of an anti-fraud approach, is really getting in at the beginning before an incident happens, before you have the panic and the stress of being in the midst of a cyber attack, and trying to close some of those gaps early.
And maybe from the claims process point of view.
In terms of claims, I would echo what Sophie has said about the need for investment in anti-fraud tech in claims. And it's because we have had this shift from being a reactive function of the business to being more proactive and looking for fraud before it occurs, trying to predict where pockets of fraud may emerge. We have also made those investments in anti-fraud tech in claims to assist us in and to really augment our anti-fraud proposition. And I think there has been a general change in insurance claims across the industry. That tech was always a wish list item. It was always something that would be nice. It would be a nice bolt-on to have if we could have that tech sort of 5 years ago. Post-pandemic, it's a prerequisite. It's your ticket to the game. If you want to do business with an insurer, you need to demonstrate that you're harnessing the best tech to mitigate the fraud risk. So there has been this shift in attitude towards fraud detection technologies, and certainly that's echoed in the investment that the insurance industry is making in that space.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is that I feel like the claims process historically was just seen as a kind of back-end sort of table stakes, whereas now it's actually a real differentiator in terms of customer experience, and the more investment in tech and in sort of that experience for consumers means that consumers are like choosing insurers because of that process, which I think is an interesting sort of repositioning of how important the claims process is.
Yeah, I think I would echo that entirely. I think claims over the years, it was always something that was looked at as money out the door, isn't it? So it's always been looked at in a slightly negative way. But now I think it's really emerging as a profession, as something that you can make a full career out. It's not just a job, it's a profession, and there are certain skills that are very key for proper claims management, particularly when you get to some of the things that I'm seeing at Tokio and Kiln, where it's large global companies, and they're looking for that expertise, and just that opportunity to really engage with someone that has experience of what happens when things go wrong.
So talking about the shift in fraud post-pandemic, I would like to do a poll and see if the audience knows, in terms of these three lines of business, which one do you believe that nowadays is the one that has more fraud claims or notifications? So cyber insurance, anyone? No? No fraud? Okay. Motor insurance? The vast majority of the audience, okay. And what about liability insurance? Just one person? Okay, right. So I think this will open very nicely to our next question, and is what are the major sources of fraud, and if there are any emerging threats, and then perhaps just to give them the answer from your perspective of what you're currently seeing in the notification landscape in the insurance industry.
Yes, I don't think there are any safe areas. I don't think there are any areas that are free from fraud. I would say that as a head of fraud. It's self-preservation to a certain extent. Traditionally we have seen fraud migrate. Fraud moves around. It doesn't stay in one place. Historically, motor was always a place where fraud gravitated to. But fraudsters, as a general rule, are motivated by three things. That's the risk of getting caught. It's how lucrative the fraudulent endeavour is. And so we've got the risk of getting caught, how lucrative it is, and also the amount of effort that's required on their part. And for that reason, given those fundamental motivations of the fraudster, motor doesn't actually look that attractive anymore. You know, you have to own a car, you have to find somebody else to have an accident with, you have to actually bend metal, you have to crash cars into each other, and that has to get through all the levels of scrutiny that insurers apply to that. They know that there's a high risk of getting caught in the motor space. Motor does still attract high levels of fraud, but pre-pandemic we were seeing the migration of fraud into the casualty liability space, where actually you don't have to have an accident at all, you can just say that you did. And you know, if you could say that you were in a supermarket on a given day and you slipped on a wet floor, or that you tripped on a defect in the pavement, and you didn't really have to provide a huge amount of evidence. So the returns were more lucrative, the risk of getting caught was lower in the casualty space because it was in our blind spot. And yes, it required a lot less effort on the part of the fraudster. Post-pandemic, where we are now, is the fraudster, there is a concern that fraudsters are removing themselves another step back from the loss event, from the peril, from that bent metal. They're taking a further step back. And actually, what are the avenues that are easiest for fraudsters and the most lucrative at the moment? It's to hijack a legitimate claim. So to insert yourself into an email exchange and redivert settlement funds into your own bank account, or to take advantage of somebody else's legitimate policy. You hijack the identity of your insured and use that identity to bring a claim against a legitimate policy that looks legitimate. So post-pandemic, what we've seen is the advent of fraud as a service industry. The real bad actors in society at the moment aren't crashing cars into each other. They're selling the know-how and the expertise, not even on the dark web anymore. It hides in plain sight. It's on social media. I was having a conversation with the heads of fraud at two very well-known delivery companies, we'll say that much. And they were pointing to adverts that are out there on Facebook offering discounts on delivery services. You know, do you want 20% off your next order? And these adverts look, for all intents and purposes, to be legitimate, but it's criminal enterprise. It's people harnessing stolen credentials and credit cards, using mule accounts to just hijack a little bit off every transaction that goes through those companies. So we have seen the rise of fraud as a service industry. It's out there, previously hidden away in the dark corners of the dark web, but now out there in hiding in plain sight. And we have these bad actors in society who are facilitating fraud. They're selling the bots, they're selling the know-how, they're selling their knowledge of our weaknesses, and actually not involving themselves in the fraud at all, just transacting and benefiting from selling that know-how onto others.
Yeah, and I think in the cyberspace, you know, I pick up on your point, Gareth, where about inserting themselves into the process, and that's absolutely something that we're seeing. So I think when you talk about cyber insurance, everyone talks about ransomware generally, and that's the big sexy thing that everyone's always talking about, and it's quite right because it is a bit of a scourge at the moment, and it's really, you know, hit insurers very hard. But what you've also got is business email compromises, which is you have these situations where the bad actors, again, insert themselves into the middle of a transaction. And I was reading an article earlier this week about the Australian property market. And this goes to the point about fraudsters shifting to what options they have available to them. The Australian property market it's hotting up again after the pandemic. It's got relatively light controls, and you've got big sums of money moving around. And more's the point, you've got vulnerable people in terms of SMEs and individuals having their money taken. So it's a big problem. And that's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing fraudsters and hackers inserting themselves into that process and redirecting the money. It is something that is definitely on the up, hidden underneath the massive tide of ransomware. There are other issues out there for sure.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely an education gap in terms of consumers and understanding these risks, because we've also seen acceleration because these fraudsters are playing on the fears of consumers, and we saw a lot of kind of COVID sort of phishing emails at the start, and then kind of, you know, vaccine, etc. So, and it always feels like it's a bit, you know, consumers will know when something's gone wrong, and then it's reported and then it's dealt with. And I do understand that it's very difficult to educate people before it happens, but I don't know if that's the insurance industry's or if it's the government, or, you know, whose problem is that? But I do feel like there needs to be some more investment into that. Absolutely.
And when it comes to talking about emerging threats, I'm always slightly reticent about predicting the future and what may happen. I was at a talk with the IFB. I delivered a talk to the IFB just as we were going into lockdown, I think. And I was talking about how businesses were going to get hit hard by lockdown, and how there was the potential for huge amounts of business interruption fraud. And I was briefing the industry on that topic and that potential threat. I didn't foresee the Chancellor stepping in and putting £11 billion into the economy, sort of no questions asked. So we never really got that hit from fraud the way we thought we may be hit by it. But I think what I would say for the future is that talking again about silos and silo mentality, we've always handled issues of information security as separate to fraud. And those lines, those distinctions are becoming more and more blurred. In the last 2 or 3 years, I've learnt more about machine learning and AI and predictive modelling than I ever thought I'd have to do in my job as a preventer of fraud. And I think the fraud fighters of tomorrow, and the real threat is that we don't keep pace with the knowledge of the fraudsters in this space. We need to be ahead of the curve and training our fraud fighters about the technology and joining those two ways of thinking about things together. We need to get better at recognising IP addresses and identifying bad actors so that we can shut them out of the insurance ecosystem altogether.
Yeah, and I think just adding to that, this is where kind of collaboration really comes into play with the insurance industry, because of, you know, when you have industry-wide databases of bad actors, or when you're sharing information to ensure that on a whole it's protected. I think that's a kind of a really important part of it, and I know like things are happening, but I know insurers need to compete to win, but like this feels like a real point where collaboration could be really positive.
You mentioned artificial intelligence. So what do you think is going to be the impact of artificial intelligence in the future of the insurance industry?
I think it's integral and almost inevitable that we will rely more on automated fraud detection processes, that AI will play an increasing role in our lives. I think the caveat I would add is that I haven't come across in the marketplace a silver bullet that means that I don't need a fraud team, that I don't need human intelligence and human judgment. I think everything in the AI space serves to augment and facilitate fraud detection. It doesn't replace human endeavour or human thought. I think there are challenges about integrating AI into your fraud detection processes. One of the things I've encountered in the last 2 years is that the people almost need to have an empathy with the logic, and they need to understand why the machine makes the decision it does. Where there is this disconnect between what the machine says is suspicious and what they in themselves, that intuitive sense of something not being right, and those things don't marry up. There is a mistrust of the AI. So there is a lot of education to be done, and people need to understand their role in retraining AI and these predictive modelling processes, and that you need to build these virtuous feedback, smart circles into your business, so you're constantly educating the AI to reduce the generation of false positives. But in terms of the future, it's inevitable that there will be these integration of technologies. We will need to do that as fraudsters become ever increasingly more sophisticated in their attempts to commit fraud against us. But it's not without its challenges.
And what about in the cyber claims environment?
I think it's certainly, so the use of AI I think certainly depends on, it's going to differ depending on what your business is like. So, you know, a large firm like Allianz may be very different to something that like a Lloyd's syndicate might do in terms of the players that are in the chain and what their books of business look like. But I think in terms of cyber claims, the thing that I see, it's already happening to be honest, where AI can have a big impact is when you're dealing with a situation where you might have a compromise of data, it's using AI to basically look at that large block of data and use that to try and work out what information may have been impacted, what type of information, is it personal, is it notifiable, and that we're already seeing certain companies develop their own AI, and it's already starting again to just reduce, particularly with business email compromises, it's really starting to reduce that cost, because the cost of so you've got to find all the data. So if you imagine like an email inbox compromise, you've got to, or multiple inboxes, so you say you've got 5 inboxes, you've got to check all of those folders, find all the emails that may identify which ones might have personally identifiable information in there. You've got to deduplicate that, which again is quite an intensive process actually, is working out how many individuals you actually have to notify. And I think AI can definitely have an impact there because it brings that ability to more quickly and efficiently analyse large amounts of data. And I think that's where the strength lies.
And just picking up on something that Gareth said, one of the emerging sectors that we're seeing in venture at the moment is around audits and controls around AI and models, because you know, like you said, you can't just sort of plug it in and go. You need to have this kind of feedback loop. But actually, you know, we've seen a lot of instances where you let AI kind of run wild and it goes wrong, and it kind of will predict the wrong thing because you're not checking it and tweaking it and make sure that it's staying. And I think the more that kind of regulators get on top of this and are holding insurers accountable to their AI models, the more that this will become important. And so kind of having controls, having an audit system, so you can really kind of explain, one, the choices that are made, but two, kind of any kind of changes or kind of shifts in the way that AIs are working. I think it's going to be a really important and kind of emerging piece of the industry.
That's very important. I agree. So how do you believe you can integrate the human process with all the anti-fraud technologies that are now available out there? Not anyone? Maybe, I don't know, Tom?
I think, yeah, picking up on my previous point, I think it's, you use the AI, so in my view it would be, at the end of the day, like, and I think Gareth has pointed this out, is that you still, certainly on these larger, more complex cases, you're still going to need human people to make those judgment calls about, is this something we take forward? Because, as I'm sure, like Gareth knows, you know, fraud is you have to make sure that it's very well evidenced, and it can be it's quite a high bar to prove. So if you're going to go with it, you need to make sure you've got a good case. So, you know, it would mean for me integrating anti-fraud systems, AI, that kind of thing, would be that you allow your, the Gareths of the world to spend their time on those cases where they can have the most impact. So the larger, high value, more complex, where is his judgment going to be more efficient or more effective, I should say, and then utilise the technology to kind of deal with maybe the lesser aspects of fraud, but also to fuel those anti-fraud teams and give them more power and more ability to pursue those fraud cases.
Absolutely. Speaking to the specific challenges of integrating AI into your fraud detection processes, first of all, it can't make people's lives more difficult. If claims handlers work very hard, they're hard-working people, they're professionals, they're experts. We can't add a layer of complexity to what is already a difficult and challenging job. So whatever AI you introduce, it has to make their life easier, and it can't present another hurdle, another barrier to delivering for the customer. And that's really the second point. Whatever AI you introduce, it has to work in the background seamlessly. It cannot interrupt the customer journey. So it's very easy for me to talk about fraud like it's happening everywhere all the time, but it's a very, very small percentage in reality of the claims that we see that actually may be suspicious or may warrant further investigation. The reality is that the vast majority of our claims pass through our business, and what we don't want to do is to put in place any barriers or challenges to that customer journey and that customer experience and frustrate that. We don't want to be generating complaints, and we certainly don't want to fall foul of any regulatory judgment by introducing a technology that interrupts what's a seamless customer journey for the majority of our customers.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No, please.
I was saying the only thing that I would add is AI needs to be taught by humans. That's the only way that it's going to get better, and that I don't think that's ever going to go away, because it's integral that, one, it's taught and that's how it sort of forms, but secondly, kind of there's always going to be exception cases that AIs can't deal with, and that it will require humans, and so there's always going to be humans there. The hope is that you just need less people, so it's kind of augments it so that either you get, you're only looking at the really complex, fun stuff, or that you can kind of distribute the work more effectively and efficiently.
Yeah, and I think to that point about training the AI and the need for human interactions, it's vitally important that we are constantly re-educating our systems because of the nature of fraud. It moves around, it evolves. So fraudsters are constantly challenging our processes to establish weaknesses, either to exploit themselves or to sell that know-how onto people who will exploit it. And in terms of setting hard and fast business rules of what fraud looks like, that's always going to be changing and shifting. So we're always going to need people to look at the outputs that the AI produces to say whether the fraud has moved on, whether those rules that we put in place on day one are still relevant, or whether we actually need to change our rules and shift our focus as the fraud evolves.
Yeah, just one thing I wanted to add to that as well is I think it's really important that if you integrate these kind of technologies that you do it in such a way that it isn't siloed within just the claims part of the business. The claims area, yes, that's where the fraud will generally occur, but if you can find a way to harness the data and the outputs that are coming from that, and then feed that into your underwriting process, I appreciate it's very difficult sometimes when you've got layered systems and it's really hard to integrate things, but I think as an ideal, as a best practice, if you can find a way that lots of areas of your business, be that compliance, underwriting, claims, you all have access to that data and the outputs that come from it.
So do you think there will be any value for artificial intelligence power voice bots into the customer service experience?
All I can say is it's not an area that I've looked at. If there are people in the room who can speak to that and their experience of it, I'd happily hear your stories and your experience in that space. But it's not something that I've.
Okay, now I was only asking because I just came across a case where I think, talking about motor insurance, They launched an app basically, and then customers, as soon as they had a car crash or an accident, basically they were able to go into the app and say, there were 5 questions, for example. They will answer the questions very quickly. And we saw that the response was basically immediately, so they knew straight away if the claim was going to be payable or not. And then what we saw with that was that the clients were not really happy. They actually felt very uncomfortable because it was immediate. So this particular company, I know they had to delay the process by a couple of minutes to start giving confidence to clients. So I was just thinking, if it's actually really adding value and to the point of fraud, the fact that you are just doing 5 questions, would that actually help? Or do you think, I know you've been mentioning that it's very important to have the human aspect involved in that. So I was just thinking, are we actually ready for that, or we still need to work more on that new technology?
Well, the one thing I would say is it's really interesting to hear that actually, because one of the things that I think we've seen in the insurance industry generally is this kind of battle between convenience and security, and that kind of constant war of making sure the customers are happy but also putting all the right protections in place. And yeah, that's just a very interesting stance, but I suppose it's we are seeing more and more insurers. So you've got the likes of Lemonade over in the US that are just removing all of these touch points out, and I do think that convenience is great and getting stuff paid quickly is great, and as a purchaser of insurance in my personal life, obviously, do I want claims paid straight away and without hassle? Yeah, of course I do. But as an insurance professional, yeah, there is. I can see why people might be a little bit squeamish about something just being approved straight away without even having to think about it. But having to build in a minute just to make people feel more comfortable, that's quite funny. That's funny to me.
Yeah, and I'd be interested to see the age breakdown of the respondents and kind of how uncomfortable, because I feel like as we move kind of the new generation coming up and everyone just wanting instant things like that, I can imagine that it's going to be an age thing. Like maybe we're not there quite yet in terms of the same with banking and financial services. People always want to speak. There's a point where people feel comfortable because they want to speak to a human being and not, a bot or a kind of an app. But we're seeing this shift in healthcare and telemedicine, and that's already started to happen. And actually, I think healthcare and insurance can sometimes follow a similar path. So I wonder if we're at that point where, we will start to see a bit more of acceptance into those things, especially as you said with the kind of the neo insurers like Lemonade sort of changing the game in terms of consumer experience.
Well, thank you. I think cautious of time, maybe it's time to open the questions to the audience. So I don't know if there are any questions.
General question to all the panel. Where do you see? Sorry, Scott Richardson from Distribution. So I ensure like the digital processes. Where do you see the best use of machine learning and AI in the sort of the fraud prevention or fraud detection value chain? And I like your point, Gareth, about making sure any new tool makes life easier for the people there. So,
who would like to answer that question?
I don't mind jumping in there. For me, I've seen already the technology delivering results in the claims space. So we have a multi-layered approach to fraud detection, and the AI and the machine learning and the predictive modelling that we've introduced allows us to be more proactive in spotting stuff earlier. So we don't have to wait until the trigger point that follows in a claim manifests itself. We get the sort of early warning from the technology that we've introduced that there's something there that may require our attention. And actually, a lot of what we do is it facilitates validation. So we can look at something that may at some point come to us as being suspicious and take a proactive look at it and actually green light it and smooth out that customer journey. So we're already seeing a return on investment in that space in claims.
And I think that is also being applied to consumers as well, where Anthemis are invested in a company called Cowbell Cyber, and their whole, they're a cyber insurance company, but it's more about the proactive, like we use external and internal data to identify those weak points, and so that you can fix it before you're actually being attacked. So I think we will see a lot of that machine learning AI in the shift from reactive to proactive insurance.
Yeah, completely agree with that. It's like I mentioned earlier, is that generally prevention is generally better than reaction in terms of reacting to cyber incidents. So if you can stop them at source, then it's going to cause a great deal less disruption to your business. So yeah.
I'm just going to pick one question from the virtual audience, and is what are the common mistakes that you see firms are making when fighting insurance fraud?
Wow.
Criticise your colleagues.
Yeah. So what do our competitors do wrong? Is that the question? I wouldn't really like to speculate about what we get wrong. More focus on what we do right, really. I think we're very good at detecting fraud, and we make the right judgment calls, and we promote technical excellence through everything that we do. So we're a customer-centric company, and we put the customer at the heart of everything we do, but we're also technically on it. And sometimes we have to make a difficult call, but it's always technically the right call. So there are traps that you can fall into with any fraud investigation. Historically, there have been tales of people doing surveillance and engaging surveillance agents in perhaps risky ways, certainly not within Allianz, but the stories are out there. I think we appreciate the customer journey more now and better than we ever have, and I think the whole anti-fraud community is perhaps less gung-ho than it was 10 years ago, and I think we're generally very good as an industry at avoiding the pitfalls that you could clumsily stumble into, because we have anti-fraud expertise in-house, and it's done by anti-fraud professionals who know the pitfalls and do what they can to avoid them and get it right.
I think we kind of touched on a few of the things. For me, there's three key ones. It's identify if AI and machine learning is appropriate for your particular business model. 2, integrate it in a way that puts the customer at the heart of everything you do. And 3, don't be complacent. It would be easy to kind of go, AI, I'm not ready for that yet. But those are the 3 things I would say. That would be mistakes I would say. They are mistakes that I would try and avoid if I was a business looking at anti-fraud.
And I'm just going to add one comment that is coming from our virtual audience, and is that the industry in general considers fraud savings as intangible until it actually hits them. So we are still in a reactive phase. And I guess before we close up, the last question would be, how vital is for small businesses to start buying cyber insurance policies?
That's definitely for you, Tom.
Tee me up. I think, look, it's. I appreciate there are some question marks around the industry at the moment because of the rising rates that are being seen in cyber insurance, but that is a correction because we have just come out of a soft market where rates and policies were being pushed out a lot. Is it important? Yes. I don't like to play that doomsday card of, oh, it's not if you get hit, it's when. But at the end of the day, cybercrime is very prevalent because, and touching on one of the points Gareth made, it's comparably quite easy. You've got ransomware as a service. You don't necessarily have to be able to develop a ransomware strain to be able to use it. You can just purchase it as ransomware as a service online. So it is very prevalent. And unfortunately for SME businesses, they are the ones that are less likely to have financial reserves or any kind of other protection, that if they have an incident, and I've seen this firsthand many times, it's not always just necessarily the, if you have a ransomware attack, it's not just the immediate, like the ransom, if that's decided that has to be paid. The businesses can be down for up to a week, 2 weeks longer, because even once if you purchase the decryption key, it's not like suddenly it lifts away and everything is as it was. Your data is all over the place. So I think cyber insurance is a vital purchase for any SME.
Thank you. I think it's time for us to finish the session. So I would like to thank you for your participation today, and to everyone that is here and is listening to us. Thank you.
Thank you.